Hey, Sierra, are you there? Can you hear me?
Yes, Tom, I can hear you.
Great, thank you. Just I always like to make sure before we get started. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Statistics Solutions Chapter 1 webinar. We have a co-host on with us today who can answer any kind of non-content related questions, kind of technical issues you're having. She will also post where you can find today's webinar, as well as some other past webinars that we've given, which are archived on our website. But the co-host will post the link to that. And I believe people also get a version sent through email to you. Yeah, one more thing before we get started. If you have questions as we go along, which is fine, just type them into the question and answer box or even the chat box, so you don't forget them. But I won't get to them until the end. Okay, and we'll have a kind of a question and answer session at the end. But if you need to type them in the box as we're going through, that's fine. I just won't get to them until the end. Okay, so let's get started. This is the chapter 1. Usually what our kind of general template is based on is pretty standard social sciences 5 dissertation structure, where chapter 1 is the introduction. Chapter 2 is usually the literature review. Chapter 3 is your methods chapter. Chapter 4 is where you present your results, and chapter 5 is the discussion. Now there are some variations to that, but usually what's included, maybe if a chapter is split up into 2 chapters, all the content is usually pretty much the same. But we do follow, like I said, the 5-chapter model, which is fairly standard. Okay, so yeah, to pull back a little bit and just to kind of understand the purpose of chapter 1 before we kind of get into the components of it, which are here. The chapter 1 is the introduction. What does that mean? The introduction to your study. It's really kind of, think of it as the blueprint for your study. It tells the reader your topic, what you're going to do. It tells the reader why you're studying what you're going to study. You know, the research problem, what drives the need for the study, and how you're going to do it, which is the methods. And the methods will be covered in great depth in chapter 3, usually, or whatever your methods chapter is. But sometimes there's some discussion, a little bit of discussion about the methods in chapter 1. And here's where I have to pause and say something that you can hear me say several times throughout the presentation, which is always obtain a template or guidelines from your school about what they want in the chapters and the sections and everything. Because while there's some degree of standardization, you know, there's some things that are common. Sometimes the schools will have their own what they want, their own particularities, things that are a little different. Maybe the sections will have different orders, or the section will have sections will have different names. So while there is some commonality across that, there are differences. So always get your school's template. If your school doesn't have a template, which sometimes they don't, but usually they do, you can sometimes ask your chair if they have a template they want you to follow, or even ask your chair for you know, an example of a dissertation they want you to follow. But again, these sections are fairly standard, and we're using a general template that would work. Okay. So yeah, this will be the sections we're covering: the introduction, background, research problem, purpose, theoretical framework, definition, significance. Other sections I've kind of squished a few sections into this because these are some sections that some schools require, some schools don't, and of course a summary at the end. All right, so the introduction, the very first section of the chapter 1. Is everybody else getting feedback? Is this just one person? If it's one person, it might be on your end. I don't know if I'm having a little static. Okay, I'm not sure what
Yeah,
to.
it sounds like something's rubbing against the speaker.
Okay, hold on. Better, worse?
It's a little bit better.
About the same. Okay. I'm not sure what's going on my end. It could be my connection. There's a hissing sound. Let me just adjust the volume. Let me see if that works. Just bear with me for a minute here. I turned the level of the volume down, but it always goes back up. Does that help at all? Too low. Okay.
Yeah, it sounds like you're further from the speaker.
What's that?
It sounds like you're further away.
Okay, let me increase the volume a little bit, but I don't want to do it too much. How's that? I've adjusted the volume where it's not too high and it's a little bit higher than it was. Does that help?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so let's get going. If folks can hear okay, not staticky, not too low, not too high. Okay. All right, so the introduction to the introduction. usually for studies, your study, there's some kind of social or organizational problem that you're addressing. So whatever that is, you want to say what that is immediately, right? And you want to anchor that problem, whether it's, let's just say special education teachers leaving the profession, or, if it's an education study, grades are low in a certain population of students in a certain area. Whatever the problem is, you want to get it up front. You want to support it. You want to anchor it with a either statistics or a peer-reviewed source, and make sure your statistics though are recent, right? You don't want to anchor, your problem that you're addressing with statistics from 10 years ago, 15 years ago. The statistics will be old. They won't reflect the recent reality. And you want to also introduce the research problem, right? So there's two different problems, right? The organization or the social problem, which your study is designed to address and provide research on. But there's also a research problem. In other words, we know certain things about this problem or about this topic. There's been certain research done on it. But the research problem, and we'll get to the research problem a little more later, is that there may be research lacking on this problem, or there may be some kind of issue that there's too much of one kind of research, or there's some issue in the research that needs to be addressed. So that's where your research problem comes in. So introduce the topic of the study, introduce what the research problem is, and this is just an introduction, so it's not that long. It just kind of it gets the reader, it just orients the reader about what your study is going to be about. So a page maybe. It shouldn't go on for pages, because you have a background section next where you can elaborate on the background of the problem. Okay. Something is rubbing. Yeah, I don't know what that sound is. It's tolerable. Okay, good. All right, I'll look into it after the presentation. I'm not sure. I've unplugged the mic a couple times and see if the connection was. Let me try it again. Okay. All right, great. Okay. So the introduction. So at the end of the introduction section, the reader should know what you're studying and why. You can also end with a preview of the sections of the chapter. This chapter 1 will contain, list of sections. Okay. The background. You're going to have to provide some historical material here to kind of get the reader up to speed on, where the problem has been. And it's not just the problem itself, it's the research on the problem also. So, this is a broad strokes kind of a background. You're looking at major trends in the research on the topic. And it kind of goes up to where the research is now. You're kind of telling a little story. And when I say story, I don't mean it's fiction, but I mean, you're kind of telling a story of where the problem started, where it's been, where it is now, and some of the major corresponding research on it. So a chronological kind of flow to it. Focus on major trends in the research, what we know about the topic, right? And so this should end with where the research stands on the topic, but also what's missing from the research, right? Because this is what you're going to be driving toward is your research problem. Okay, here's what we know about special education teachers leaving the profession. Here's the research that's been done on it. Here's where we are now. Here's the research that's still missing. Here's the angle that people haven't looked at, and that's going to be where your study comes in, right? So think of it as a funnel, kind of gets kind of broad and kind of historical, and it funnels to the present into your topic, into the research problem. And that's where we are here. Now, the research problem. Now, just to go back real quick, the background, how many pages, whatever it needs, it could be several pages, right? Because you're going to have to be covering some historical ground, covering ground on the major trends of the research. So it could be several pages. The research problem. So it gets us to where what's missing in the research, right? And that's a kind of research problem. Let's just stop and talk about what a research problem is for a minute, because sometimes people are a little hazy on what it means. And it's like it sounds. It's a problem in the research. So it can be a gap, right? A gap is a type of research problem, meaning there's a gap in knowledge. We don't know something about a topic, right? That's a type of research. There's others. It could be that the research we have on a topic is predominantly qualitative, or it's predominantly quantitative, and we need the other one, right? It could be that only certain theories or only certain instruments have been used, and we could get different useful information if we used a different approach or a different theory or a different instrument. So whatever the research problem is, right, this is what you were leading to in the background. And now the research problem section is a more kind of focused treatment, or more focused discussion of specifically what the research problem is. And the research problem section usually isn't long, maybe a page at the most, but it needs to be really focused. It needs to, here's what the research problem is. Here's the research. And usually you're going to focus more on recent research here, because what might have been, a problem 10 years ago may not be one anymore, or it may be study may have been conducted. So recent research, primarily for the research problem. Here's the research that's been conducted. Here's what we know. That highlights what we don't know, or that highlights whatever the problem is, which is what your study is going to be focused on. For this section, for every section really, but some sections you'll really benefit more. It's always a good example. It's a good idea to use an example, or to get an example of an approved dissertation from your school in your area close to what you're doing. You can go through ProQuest, which you can access through your school's library. You could also ask your chair. Sometimes they're happy to provide you with an example of a dissertation that they think is solid, that they want you to look at. But especially like the research problem, because you're going to listen to me talk and you're going to kind of get it, but then when you sit down to write, it may or may not make sense. So it's always good to have an example or two at hand when you're drafting. So right, it transitions from the background. It's a more targeted overview of recent research on the topic, what's been done, what highlights what still needs to be done. You want to specifically state the research problem, and specifically state that your study is designed to address that. And one quick thing about if your research problem is a gap, right? Like a gap in knowledge. We don't have information on this certain topic, or from a certain angle. I get the question of, how do you define something that by nature is, or not by nature, by definition, is an absence, right? A gap means there's nothing there. So how do you define something that's not there? And I use an analogy that I took from someone else, but it helps me understand it, and it makes sense. And I'll pass it along to you. If you think of a donut, right? A donut, and then it has the hole in the middle. How do you describe the donut hole? You can't, because there's nothing there. So what you do is you describe the donut. And in describing the donut, you highlight the absence, the middle, right? So it's a way to think about your research problem if it's a gap, right? You can't just say, hey, there's a gap in the literature. We could say it, but you need to show that there's a gap, and to show that, you describe the research around it, and then it helps highlight the gap, and then you can say that there's a gap, and when you say it, you can you have shown to your reader, to your chair, to your reviewers, you've shown the gap, right? You just didn't say that one exists. You've shown it by looking at the research around it. Okay. The purpose section, purpose statement. The purpose statement is usually the first sentence of the purpose section. And the purpose statement has a very specific construction, and I've provided it here. I have two examples, one quantitative, one qualitative. But it's basically, the formula is basically this: the purpose of this approach, design, study is to examine, explore your concept or your variables in whatever sample setting. So let's look at an example. The purpose of this quantitative approach, correlational design study, is to examine, investigate, usually more associated with quantitative studies, explore, usually associated with qualitative studies. So the verb matters. It's not, hyper, real important, but it does matter a little bit. To examine the relationship, and this is your variables, your concept, the relationship between transformational leadership and emotional intelligence. Those will be your concept in whatever sample, whatever setting it is. Okay, same thing for qualitative, just changed the fill in the blank parts. The purpose of this generic qualitative study is to explore the challenges of African American women as they advance to positions as university presidents in, and again, whatever your specific sample is, your specific setting is. But that's how you should word your purpose statement. That's usually specific to that kind of construction. And the purpose statement is like the research questions, in the sense that whenever you need to rephrase or mention your purpose statement later in the document, anytime, your purpose statement doesn't change, right? So don't think, I'm going to change the wording because it just sounds repetitious to say the same thing about my purpose statement. Your purpose statement is fixed, right? It doesn't change. Same with your ARC once it's approved, and same with your RQs. They don't change either. If you need to mention them again, you use the exact same language. Now, that's the only time you get a pass by essentially kind of using the same language. Like, so for other, like if you wanted to take a section of your work from one chapter and put it in another chapter, professors frown on that, right? They don't like you to kind of just copy and paste. But again, for the purpose statement, for the research questions, that's what you need to do. All right, and so for the purpose section, it's not usually much longer than that. You have the purpose statement, and it may also include specific information about your variables, maybe a little more information about your concepts. Maybe mention the instruments that you're using if it's quantitative, but take a look again at your guide and take a look at your samples. But the purpose is usually a solid paragraph, not much more than that. Research questions usually come here. State the research questions. If you are looking for help in developing research questions, those are usually covered in our method seminars. So I would suggest, if you're interested in that specifically, to check out one of those. Okay, theoretical framework usually comes next, or conceptual framework. Again, get your, refer to your template, because some schools are different with the theoretical framework. about the placement of it. Some schools want it in chapter 1, and then they want it elaborated upon in chapter 2. Some schools just want it in chapter 1. Some schools just want it in chapter 2. So again, that's going to be particular to what your school wants or what your chair wants. If it does appear in chapter 1, basically it's the theory or the theoretical framework or the conceptual framework that's going to guide your study from a theoretical perspective. The first question we need to get to address is, what's the difference between a theoretical framework and a conceptual framework? I take a very practical approach, which is theoretical frameworks are typically associated with quantitative studies, and conceptual frameworks are typically associated with qualitative studies. So how do you handle the section? Really, you just want to start off by, a simple declarative sentence, something like, transformational leadership theory will serve as the theoretical foundation or the theoretical framework for this study, right? Then define the theory, using sources, obviously, to anchor your definition. You want to define any components that are relevant to your study. For example, something like transformational leadership, it has 4 components. If you're studying those, if they're important to your study, you want to define those also. Talk a little bit about who developed it and why they developed it, right? Theories are developed to explain things and to explain phenomenon. So talk a little bit about what the person developed it for. You want to talk a little bit about what other researchers have used the theory for, what they've used it to explain. And then the important part is how it connects to your study, right? How it relates to what you're doing. All the steps are similar for a conceptual framework. The big difference is that usually for a theoretical framework, for quantitative study, you're using questionnaires, right, or surveys. And the surveys always have a theoretical basis, right? Researchers don't, the questions on the surveys don't come from just thin air, right? They have a theoretical foundation somewhere. So you want to use the theory that's associated or the basis for the questionnaire or the surveys, right? So let's just take emotional intelligence, for example. You're measuring emotional intelligence as one of your variables. There's several surveys for emotional intelligence, right? So whichever one you're using, you want to use the theorist for the definition of the theory that's associated with that survey. Let me see if I can clarify that a little bit. So if you're using Goleman, say Goleman's survey for emotional intelligence, you want to use Goleman's theory of emotional intelligence for your theoretical framework, right? Because there's others, like I said, there's going to be other emotional intelligence surveys. There are going to be other theorists who developed them. So you don't want to use Smith's theory, but Goleman's survey, right? Whoever survey you use, want to use the theory that's associated with that survey, because they may be slightly different. For conceptual frameworks, there may not be a theory because qualitative research tends to be exploratory. There may not be a theory that covers what you're looking for. So you usually have to go with kind of major concepts. So let's see, if we go back to our qualitative purpose here, the purpose of this generic qualitative study is to explore the challenges of African American women as they advance to positions as university presidents. So something like that, you know, maybe you don't have a theory that covers that. But then, you know, you would build a conceptual framework from you know, barriers, challenges, maybe, right, for women. And this goes back to the theoretical or conceptual framework. Sorry, I was just kind of making a reference back to that. So for something like that, you would use maybe the concept of barriers and challenges to women, and you know, and maybe to African American individuals or African American women, and those kind of barriers and challenges would constitute like your conceptual framework. And for the qualitative study, the conceptual framework also guides your interview questions, right? So you don't, again, your questions don't just come from you or just come from thin air. Your framework for a qualitative study, your conceptual framework is going to help you guide those questions. Okay. Sometimes a chapter one, again, refer to your template. Sometimes the chapter one has a section called Nature of the Study or Study Design, where it wants you to talk a little bit about your approach and your design. Again, this isn't a methods-oriented webinar, so if you're interested in more of that, check out one of our methods webinars. But usually they include a rationale for the selection of the design, summarized in methodology, including from whom and how the data will be collected, and how data will be analyzed. Yes, and study designs covered in methods webinars. Okay. Let's see, definitions. This is a section where you know, you define specific terms and key terms that are going to be used in your study. You know, and what are those? Definitely your variables, right? Any constructs you're measuring, any variables, factors, those will need to be defined. You know, any major, usually not theories, but major concepts, again. A definition should be in the form of sentences. I mean, I just default to that. Sometimes templates don't say if they should be sentences or not. I always recommend using sentences because sometimes chairs will come back and say, put this in the form of a sentence. And if you just do it from the beginning anyway, then you're already ahead of the game. And nobody's ever going to come back and say, this should be a fragment instead of a sentence. So definitions should be clear and succinct. This is what sometimes where people get a little confused. They do too much. This is not a discussion section, so you're defining terms, you're not discussing them, right? So it's not, well, this theorist defines emotional intelligence as this, but another theorist says it's this. Again, they're not discussions, they're definitions. Define the term as you're going to be using it for your study, right? That can usually be done in a really clear, concise sentence. Sometimes you need a couple sentences, but it shouldn't be more than that. Definitions should be supported with peer-reviewed sources. Absolutely, under no circumstances should you use dictionary definitions, because these, again, are not general definitions of terms. They're terms specific to the literature and specific to the way you're using them in your study. So the sources you anchor them with need to come from the literature, and they need to be peer-reviewed. Sources should be recent when possible. Yeah, but if if you can't do it, that's fine. Okay, and also the entries need to be alphabetized, sequenced alphabetically. And usually there's no text in this section other than the definitions themselves. I mean, you can have a lead-in sentence if you want, something like, the following terms are defined for use in the study, period. And that's it. And then go to your definitions. Okay, significance. This is what professors like to call the so what section. Like, so you're doing the study. So what's it going to tell us? Why is it important? Why is it of value? Right, that's what you cover in the significance section. And usually there's two prongs to it, right? How your study is going to contribute to theory and or research, and how your findings from your study might inform practice. So you can definitely section it out that way if you want to. You can use subsections or not, but just have, 2 sections. So, why is your study going to be important? What kind of data might it get, information might it get, and to whom will it be important? Well, for research, how might it contribute to the literature? What is it going to tell researchers? It might tell them that something is important to focus on that we didn't think was, or vice versa. Something isn't important anymore, or it might add to our understanding of a theory, right? That hasn't been applied to a certain population. So think about how your findings might contribute to the research. And in chapter 5, there's going to be a section where you talk about this, but you talk about it in the past, in the sense right now you're forecasting how your study might be significant. In chapter 5, or the discussion chapter, you're going to talk about actually what you found, and actually how what you found is important in these ways. But again, this is kind of future looking. You also want to think about how your findings might inform people at the level of practice, right? The people are doing, what it is you're studying. So if, you're studying counseling or something, how's your information that you get from your study might it inform what counselors do, in the everyday, in the clinic, or at the everyday level? How might it inform what they do? Walden is a school that, if you're at Walden, they have a little third section they want in here, and that's implications for social change. So how might your study contribute to positive social change, which is just, if you're at that school, that's another thing you have to consider. And usually it's kind of self-explanatory. If you're helping students get better grades, or if your information might help, teachers teach students or something, that helps better their educational opportunities, and which might help, better their post-school, their careers or whatever. Okay, other sections, I've kind of squished these together. Some schools have them, some schools don't. Limitations, again, this is forward looking. In chapter 5, you're going to have a section called limitations, which is based on what actually were limitations to your study. But right now it's forward looking. They want you to discuss any kind of potential weaknesses or shortcomings that may affect your results. I know this is hard to foresee, right? But for one thing, we're still kind of dealing with COVID. Sometimes that throws a wrench in people's gears. In the study, they can't, maybe they can't get to the population study sample they want. Obviously for interviews, it changes the nature of interviews, from face to face to like Zoom. Is that a limitation? I don't know. You have to decide, if it could be. So things like that. And for quantitative studies, low sample size is a big limitation. It's hard to, forecast whether you're going to get an adequate sample size. Sometimes bias is a limitation. Qualitative studies. In qualitative studies, researcher bias is always a potential limitation, especially if you're too close to a subject. There are methods for helping to ensure your objectivity. You'd want to look those up. I think one's called bracketing, where you kind of bracket your experiences and your preconceptions and set them to the side. If you're doing a study that's on whether it's qualitative or quantitative, if it's on a sensitive topic, say sexuality, or or maybe certain kinds of diseases, where people may not they may be a little sensitive about opening up and giving honest answers. Sometimes there's something called social desirability bias. which means that people will answer in ways that put them in a positive light rather than honestly. And that does happen, and it does happen in, like I said, especially studies with sensitive topics. So that's something you'd want to look at. Assumptions, this is a little tricky one. And these sections are really helpful if you look at previous, if you look at examples to see what people have done. Assumptions are things that you have to assume because they're outside of your control, right? So to move forward with the study, you just have to assume certain things. And one of the big ones is that you have to assume that your participants will be honest, right? You don't have control over them. You don't have control over what they say. So you just have to assume that what they tell you will be open and honest and forthright. That's an example of an assumption. Scope, sometimes called delimitations. They're not really limitations, even though it has the word limitation in them. They're kind of the boundaries of your study. These are things that you have control over, that you set the boundaries, right? If you think of scope, right? If you look through a scope, microscope, or even, binoculars, something like that, you have the area that you can see, and then you have everything around it is kind of black, right? So think of that as the scope of your study. Everything in the visual field is what your study is including, and everything beyond that is what you're excluding. And usually it sounds similar to your purpose. You probably restate your population, your setting, the things you're concentrating on. And it's also helpful in studies, like say you're doing an education study and you're just focusing on teachers. You want to reemphasize that you're focusing on teachers, and you're excluding students, you're excluding administrators, you're excluding parents, right? It just helps to kind of define the boundaries of your study. And the summary, right? And just like any summary, recap the major points of the chapter, remind the reader of the research problem and why your study is needed and important. And if you want, you can end by transitioning to the next chapter. And when I say recap major points of the study, do a real recap, right? Don't just say I did this, 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 and this, and have a list of like the sections, right? Excuse me, do an actual recap of the important points. Okay. And this is who we are. Okay, and this is what we offer, and this is our contact information. And if you want to find out more about what we do, of course, feel free to contact us. I'll take questions now. If anybody has any questions, you can type them into the question and answer box. Oops, sorry, I'll leave that up. My dog has a question, but I can't understand that question. Any other question? Any questions? Any other questions? No, everybody's good with the chapter 1 then? Okay. All right, well, great. Well, good luck. Use your resources. Yeah, let us know if you just want to talk about what we offer. Okay, great. Yep, you're welcome. Okay, well, thank you everybody for attending, and we do offer these on other chapters and other topics. So, check out our schedule on our website, and see if there's other ones that that you'd like to attend. All right. Yep. Thank you. Thank you for attending. Okay. Have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.